lunch here. Good afternoon. My name is Tim Fryfogle. As Michelle mentioned earlier, we have the NERC recently released the NERC WRA. I'm going to provide some specific highlights from that report and also dive into the ReliabilityFirst Winter Outlook Resource Risk Assessment. So next slide, please. So we're going to walk through the NERC WRA risk summary, the NERC waterfall charts specifically to PJM and MISO, which most directly affect ReliabilityFirst footprint. Then I'll walk through the ReliabilityFirst resource adequacy analysis and our ReliabilityFirst random generation outage risks going forward. Next slide, please. So here's the NERC WRA, their risk summary chart. Specifically, we can focus in on PJM and MISO. So if you could see PJM section right there, they are in that hashed marked section. And I'll dive a little bit deeper into why that specifically is hash marked, but they are an elevated risk because of that specific risk. And MISO is also at an elevated risk because of that above normal conditions, which would be a higher load, higher outages scenario that might occur going forward. At a higher level, MISO's reduced natural gas fire generation by over 5 gigawatts since last winter, which kind of contributed to the decline in available resources. And their internal capacity was offset by 2 gigawatts of firm capacity imports into the area. And then MISO was also helped by the lower peak demand forecast by over 4 gigawatts since last winter. So those are some high-level overviews of what's going on in the MISO footprint. And in PJM, despite the increase in winter peak demand by over 3.2 gigawatts, the planned reserve margins risen slightly with increased firm imports and demand response going forward. So high level, those are the issues that are going on with PJM and MISO going forward. Next slide, please. So now we're going to dive into the waterfall charts and their reserve margin analysis going forward. So if I can point your attention to the graph on the right, those different shades of blue lines going forward. As you can see, this is last year's charts, the 2023-2024, which is on the left, and then this year's 2024-2025, where they compare the two. As you can see, the anticipated reserve margin and their prospective reserve margin is above their reserve margin requirement going forward. So as we kind of focus our attention into the waterfall chart itself in the middle, I'll start with the left. So you see the dark blue line, which is the resources, the anticipated resources that will be happening on the peak hour of what MISO projects. And as we work our way from left to right, you'll see these solid red bars. So we have the typical maintenance outages that MISO projects to have on that peak hour, which is about 18.8 gigawatts. We have typical forced outages, which is what MISO has been seeing in the last 3 years going forward, which is about 21.5 gigawatts. You can kind of subtract that going from the resources from, as you work your way right. And then you have about 10 gigawatts of fuel supply issues. And then right there in the low wind scenarios, those are hash marks because those are scenarios or more extreme scenarios that could occur. MISO's have declared that as being, extreme type scenario going forward. And that's why that's a negative 7.4 gigawatts going forward. They have 2.4 gigawatts of operational mitigation megawatts. And then finally, all the way to the right, you have your peak demand. So the solid bar, about the 90 gigawatts that you're seeing, is the 50-50, or what they, under normal conditions, normal load, is what MISO projects to happen for this winter. Then the hash marks on top of that is the 94.2 gigawatts. So the 4.2 roughly is hash marked. So that would be in a more extreme scenario. They're high load. Something that would not happen very frequently. So that's their extreme demand forecast going forward. And then just in the general, generating capacity is about 10 gigawatts lower compared to the last winter. And that's mainly due to generators that have been retired or withdrawn from MISO's capacity market due to supply chain issues, falling out of the queue because of lack of funding, things like that. And then there are some megawatts also that have a lower winter accredited capacity, which would be wind or solar based on their ELCC capacity values. And MISO continues to work with its members on the winter preparedness for fuel sufficiency. They've sent out surveys. They poll their members frequently to make sure that they can identify risks early and get on top of it before the winter season comes forward. Next slide, please. So now we're working into the PJM waterfall chart from the NERC assessment. Again, I'll direct you to the right over there where you have the reserve margins. Both their anticipated and their prospective reserve margin is above their reference margin level, which makes them considered a low risk regarding the reserve margin requirement specifically. But as I mentioned earlier, there has been an issue that kind of developed concerning the Transco Regional Energy Access. It's called RIA. It's a natural gas pipeline is used by PJM natural gas fired generation that has the potential of being shut in, which means that natural gas the gas is shuttered at the well and not be able to be transported through the pipelines into the potential for natural gas facilities using it. There's a projection of 20 gigawatts of natural gas fired generation to be affected by this, and most of that is in the location of Eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They have direct or indirect access to this natural gas facility. We are highlighting this because this is considered to be a risk based on the court's action on how they want to move on that going forward. It recently came into our purview as a potential risk going forward. It has been mentioned in the NERC WRA, and we felt it was extremely important to discuss this at the RF newsletter article that is going out here shortly. So low chance of happening, but there is a potential risk there of happening going forward. Next slide. So now we're going to walk our way over to the RF WRA, which is where we kind of dive into the numbers a little bit more. So it kind of helps you see what how short or how above the reserve margin requirements that they are. I'm not going to really read off all the numbers, but I think the main important thing is the planning reserve margin for PJM is 40.6, and their requirement is 30%. So, pretty good above the reserve margin requirement going forward. MISO is 55.8. Their planning reserve requirement is 49.4. I believe this is their first or second season of their seasonal reserve margin requirements. So they do their reserve margin calculations seasonally now. That's why that number is significantly higher than the summer going forward. But they are above their planning reserve margin going forward. I'm able to carve out the RF footprint based on a little bit of the MISO areas and the PJM areas. And as you can see, the projected peak reserves is 60,762 megawatts. So we at our ReliabilityFirst say since PJM and MISO are above their projected reserve margin requirements, ReliabilityFirst is also above their projected reserve margin requirements going forward. Next slide, please. So another aspect of the ReliabilityFirst assessment is we use this exact same numbers that go into the NERC WRA. We use the same load and resource data gathered through the NERC Reliability Assessment Group, the RAS. Where we go is we do a different analysis regarding the waterfall charts. And that's that third bullet going down is that we use historical GADS data where NERC pulls the assessment areas on what the assessment areas feel that they want to put into the report based on historical data. We use a 5-year rolling period where PJM uses a 3, and we focus in on those November through February months to kind of shine a spotlight on those potential days going forward. So some differences that go on between the ReliabilityFirst and the NERC published report, but overall we're seeing similar results going forward. Next slide, please. So this is our second iteration of this line graph. So if you've been around, we introduced this during our summer reliability assessment. We thought that the waterfall chart was becoming a bit confusing or hard to understand. So we decided to go forward and develop something a little bit different. We've been working with our communications team to figure out what would work best going forward. So what you're seeing here in your line graph is, first of all, the black line are maintenance outages. So MISO projects to have maintenance outages that occur on the peak hour, which is what we analyze going forward. And then off of the black line, you see the red going there. And as you can see, is there's what we're using the GADS data for is we're seeing a lower probability, which is there are less days that there are that amount of outages going forward. So the best way to explain it would be, as you can see the 0.2, and you follow that line over, and you're seeing roughly 36,000 megawatts. So of all the days that we analyzed, 0.2 days probability of that amount of outages occurring on that during that peak hour of analysis going forward. So those yellow dots are the 90-10 and 50-50 load. And since we're seeing that there is a probability of the 90-10 load and the amount of generator outages that we collected from the GADS of it becoming a low risk, but there is a risk. That's why we concur with NERC that's saying that there is an elevated risk for MISO for the WRA. And, we'll get to the PJM one and you'll see the differences in the dots, but we'll focus on MISOs here first. So you see the 90-10, there is some amount of outages that occur in our last 5 years that overlap with the 90-10 load forecast going forward. And with the 50-50, you're seeing even a lower amount of probability that occur and the higher amount of outages. So that means, we're just not seeing the 40,000 megawatts of outages occurring very frequently in the last 5 years of the MISO GADS data going forward. And again, across the board, during normal operating conditions, there'll be minimum probability. That's normal operations would be the 50-50. And then during the 90-10, there's some demand obligations with operating reserve has an elevated risk during demand response that will be required during those outages going forward. Next slide, please. So as you can see, if you can remember what the MISO one looks like, you can see the PJMs, just that there is just a very low probability of that 90-10 and the 50-50 forecasts or the outages occurring that happened going forward. PJM does not project to have any maintenance outages occurring on their peak hour. So that's why they do not have that black line like MISO does. So that's why the red line starts right at 0 with just the amount of outages that we're seeing. If you can kind of compare the lines, they are slightly different in just the amount of outages that occur from the PJM and MISO going forward. But since PJM's 2 yellow dots that occur, the 90-10 and the 50, occur at such a low probability that's why we're thinking that on a resource adequacy analysis, PJM is at a low risk, but they are become elevated because of that Transco RIA gas pipe potential court filing that could occur going forward. So that's why they're considered an elevated risk, just because of that one risk going forward. Next slide, please. So to sum it all up, here's my last slide. Just be an elevated concern during that extreme, that 90-10, those yellow dots that are a little bit above in the probability range of the 0.2 going forward. And generally, the generating capacity is about 10 gigawatts lower compared to the prior winter season. And that's because of retired withdrawn from MISO's capacity market. And some receive lower winter accreditation. Again, that's solar and the wind, the ELCC values going forward. PJM is at a low risk based on resource adequacy analysis, but there is an elevated risk because of that Transco regional natural gas pipeline project that is within the courts working itself out, and there is a potential there of some 20 gigawatts of natural gas fired generation that could be affected by that court filing going forward. So I believe that is my last slide. So next slide, please, Michelle. So there's my contact information. I'll open it back to Michelle to see if they have any questions for me.
Sure, thank you, Tim. That was a great summary of the winter reliability assessment. And we do have a few questions that came in. So I'll just start with the first one. Is there a specific time of day used for peak load min or max generation?
So typically it's their peak hour. So if you would think about the summer, it would probably be the hottest day, that hottest hour, probably 3, 4, or 5 o'clock, during the day where all that sun kind of builds up. During the winter, it would be typically, during a very colder day where you have a lot of electric baseboard heating that kicks on. Your wind and solar, cloudy day, your wind and solar is not being affected, so you don't have a lot of generation from those elements. So it varies based on the load conditions, which is the most highest factor when it comes regarding load. It would be air conditioning during the summer and baseboard heating during the winter going forward. I can't say specifically what hour. I don't know which the peak hour is. I should probably know that, but I don't.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Moving on to our next question. The question is, I think you said that the forced outages were based on historical data. Do we
Yes.
think the forced outages may be less with the new standards implemented?
I can't say for certain. As the standard becomes more socialized within the industry, and cold weather events could be affected that in some way. I could see generation outages going down, but with using historical GADS data, it's going to take a couple of years to build that through the system before we start to see it. We are now just almost done collecting 2024 GADS data. I have not had a chance to analyze that yet because the deadline's not due yet, but I could see that as being one potential factor in lessening generation outages, but there are many factors going through the winter months that affect that. But yes, I could see that being a good outcome with that standard.
Okay, great, thanks. Next one. MISO has indicated a 7.4 gigawatt reduction for a low wind scenario. However, MISO has observed as much as a 12 gigawatt reduction during cold weather. And the question is, should they be required to correct? Is there any course that you know of for correcting that number?
So that's a great question. Yes, so NERC does pull the assessment areas. So yes, that should be factored in through the upcoming year. I'm not sure exactly what year that happened. If that did happen this year, since this data was collected kind of early, almost mid-year, enough to give PJM or NERC to process the data and then create the report, that will be reflected in next year's WRA as MISO finalizes those numbers, collects the data, and then supplies it to us for next year.
Great, thank you. The next question, based on some learnings from the ITCS study, how much power approximately can be transmitted between PJM and MISO to help cover one another during winter emergencies? I don't know if you know that off the top of your head.
No, I do not.
Yeah, that's okay. We can circle back with that one.
Yes. I know there are, I can definitely reach out to other ESP members or other RF staff to provide that number.
Okay. Next question, the planning reserve requirement for MISO is 49.4%. Is that based on a 1 in 10 year calculation? And how many resources do they believe are required to get through the winter?
So the 49.4% is based on an LOLE study. The 1 day in 10, as you referred to, is so yes. RF has a regional standard BAL 502, which both PJM and MISO adhere to, and they calculated that 49.4 based on that 1 day in 10. I'm not sure exactly the answer to the second question. I know MISO has typically roughly 50 gigawatts of megawatts between their net capacity resources and their net internal demand. So I would think the 50 gigawatts would be a potential buffer between that provides that 1-day and 10 type criteria and calculation.
Okay, you broke up there a little
Not
at the end, but
sure if that is,
oops.
if they could say if that answered the question, I'm not sure. If I'm answering the question there, I'm not sure, but okay, go ahead.
I was just saying you broke up a little bit there, Tim, at the end. Just
Okay.
the last couple sentences that you said.
I apologize. If they could reach out to see if I did respond, but if you take the net capacity resources minus the net internal demand, it's about 50 gigs of buffer that they have for MISO.
Okay, I think we heard all that this time.
Good.
The question kind of relating to that, how much megawatt buffer is wind and solar versus dispatchable?
I don't have it broken out by specific fuel types. The wind and solar calculation does include their ELCC capacity factors, which is so imagine a 100 megawatt farm. If you want to participate in the markets, they get an ELCC value, which is a D rate, because they can't be on all the time, and that's how they get their payments. That capacity does include their ELCC values, but I do not have it broken out by fuel type.
Okay. And then last question. Give me a second. Is the MISO risk throughout their entire footprint, or could it be characterized as a specific geographical area, whether it's by state or through the subregions like MISO North in the RF region? Is that more susceptible to the cold weather?
So since MISO operates as a whole, we do categorize MISO as an elevated risk. There is some geographical characteristics of MISO that kind of pose challenges for them. You have MISO North and Central, and then you have MISO South. And there is a transfer limit between MISO South and MISO North and Central. That limit is calculated into this as a whole for MISO, but MISO typically has a little bit more megawatt availability in the South than they have in the North and the Central area. But they do use that transfer between MISO South and MISO North and Central as part of their calculations as a whole. But as a whole, MISO is considered elevated because they operate as MISO as a whole.
Great, thank you. I think that answered the question very well. And that was our last question. So thank you so much, Tim. And